The dinner was supposed to be a regular Sunday thing. Her mother's house, her siblings around the table, the usual noise of a family that had opinions about everything and never ran out of ways to share them. I had been to dozens of these dinners by then. I knew the rhythms. I knew who talked over who deferred to who, and I knew exactly where I sat in the unspoken hierarchy of that household. Near the bottom. Not because I was rude, not because I had ever done anything to earn that position, but because I didn't perform. I didn't fill silences with opinions just to be heard. I didn't argue about sports or politics to seem like I had weight. I listened more than I talked, and in that family, that read as weakness. I was used to it. What I wasn't used to was hearing my wife be the one to say it out loud. She was talking to her sister near the kitchen doorway. I was at the table, close enough to hear without being close enough to make it awkward. She didn't know I could hear. Or maybe she did and decided it didn't matter. Either way, the words came out clearly and without hesitation. He just lets things happen to him. I love him, but he's always been that way. Weak. Her sister made a sound that might have been sympathy or agreement. I couldn't tell which was worse. I didn't move. I didn't tighten my jaw or clear my throat or find a reason to walk over and interrupt. I picked up my glass, took a slow drink, and looked out the window at the backyard where her nephew was kicking a ball against the fence. Something settled in me at that moment. Not anger, not hurt. Something quieter and more deliberate than either of those. I let the words sit there. Weak. I turned it over in my mind, the way you turn over a coin to check which side is which. I thought about whether it was true. I thought about all the things I had done in the last 8 months that she didn't know about. The calls I'd made. The records I'd started keeping.
The single conversation I'd had with a family law attorney in March that I had told no one about. And I thought, let her keep that word. Let the whole table keep it if they want. Because I already knew what was coming. And I had already decided that the most powerful thing I could do was nothing. Not yet. So I smiled when she came back to the table. I passed the bread. I answered questions when people asked them. I was polite and unremarkable and completely invisible, exactly like I wanted to be. We met through mutual friends at a work event 7 years before that dinner. She was sharp, funny, confident in a way that filled the room without seeming like she was trying. I liked that immediately. I had spent most of my life around people who needed to perform their confidence, and she seemed like she actually had it built in. We dated for 1.5 years before I proposed. The relationship was good. Not perfect, but real. We argued about small things, agreed on the bigger ones, and I genuinely believed we were building something that would last. She came from a family where status mattered. Not in a cruel way, just in a structural way. Her father had been successful in business, and the whole family carried that standard forward. Her older brother ran his own company. Her sister had married well. Success was the family language, and it was spoken fluently in every gathering. I worked in operations management, steady, detail-oriented work that paid well, but didn't come with a title that impressed anyone at her family's table. I wasn't flashy. I didn't talk about money or deals or wins. I came home, I did my work, I took care of things quietly. I think in the early years she appreciated that, or at least she said she did. Somewhere in the 4th year, something shifted. I couldn't name it exactly at the time. She started making small edits to how she described me to people.
Instead of he's really good at what he does, it became he's pretty steady, reliable. Reliable started to sound like the kindest version of a word she didn't want to say yet. I noticed. I didn't bring it up because at the time it felt too small to argue about. That was my first mistake, not the last. The dinner table comment crystallized something I had already been sensing for over 1 year. She had a habit of reframing me in public. Not brutally, not with obvious cruelty, just with consistent, quiet pressure applied to the image of who I was, until the people around us had a version of me that she had built and I had never agreed to. At her colleague's birthday party, she laughed and told the group that I was terrible with decisions. The story she used was about a car we almost bought 3 years earlier. I had taken 2 weeks to research it. She called it paralysis. The people laughed. I smiled. At a neighborhood gathering, when someone asked how we handled finances, she said, "I mostly take the lead on that," which was not true. We had always managed money jointly, but I let it go. At her brother's house one evening, she told a story about a work situation I had handled that made it sound like I had been walked over by a colleague, when in reality the outcome had been entirely in my favor. She just didn't know the ending because she hadn't asked. Each one of those moments was small, plausibly deniable, maybe even unintentional in isolation. But I'm a person who works in operations. I look at patterns, not individual data points. And the pattern was clear. She was constructing a version of me that was less than what I was, and she was doing it in rooms full of people who would remember. Not because she was evil. I don't think it was that simple. I think she needed to be the competent one, the strong one, and the easiest way to do that was to quietly make me smaller. The problem was, she had started to believe the version she was building.
Here is what she did not know about the 8 months leading up to that Sunday dinner. In February, I noticed a pattern in our joint account that didn't match our budget. Not a dramatic number, nothing that would trigger an alarm on its own, but I track things. I have a system. And when I ran the numbers against our shared expenses spreadsheet, there was a consistent gap. Small transfers, irregular enough not to form an obvious pattern to a casual eye, regular enough that I counted 7 of them over 4 months, totaling a little over $9,000. All moved to an account I didn't have visibility into. I didn't confront her. I documented. I photographed the statements. I created a separate file on a personal device she didn't have access to. I noted dates, amounts, and the account numbers the transfers referenced. Then I did what I do with any problem that has real stakes. I got outside expertise. In March, I had a 1-hour consultation with a family law attorney. I told her I wasn't sure I was heading toward divorce. I told her I just wanted to understand the landscape. She told me that what I was describing, if accurate, would be considered dissipation of marital assets in most states. She told me documentation was everything. She told me to keep going. So I did. I told no one. Not my brother, not my closest friend. I went home, I was present, I was engaged, I did the grocery run on Saturdays and watched the shows she wanted to watch, and sat at her mother's dinner table like a man with nothing on his mind. This is what patience actually looks like from the inside. Not weakness, not passivity. Preparation. Her brother's name was Daniel. He was 4 years older than her, ran a mid-sized logistics company, and had never fully accepted me as someone worthy of his sister. He wasn't aggressive about it. He was just always slightly evaluating, slightly reserved, like I was still in a probationary period that had no clear end date.
In April, 3 months before the dinner, he called me directly. That was unusual. We didn't have a phone relationship. The call came on a Tuesday evening while my wife was at a yoga class, and the tone of his voice from the first sentence told me this was not casual. He said he had some concerns. He said he had been hearing things that worried him. He said he felt it was his responsibility to be honest with me as a family member. What followed was a carefully delivered list of claims that my wife had apparently been sharing with him over several months. That I was bad with money. That I had made some irresponsible financial decisions that she had been covering for. That I was unreliable under pressure. That she was carrying more than her share and didn't know how to tell me. I listened to the entire thing without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Daniel, I appreciate you telling me directly. I want you to know I hear what you're saying. I also want you to know that what you've been told doesn't match the actual record. But I'm not going to argue with you about it right now, because right now I don't think argument is what this situation needs." He seemed surprised I hadn't pushed back harder. Maybe he had expected defensiveness. What he got was composure, and composure is harder to argue with than anger. I thanked him for the call, told him I hoped we could sit down together at some point, and ended the conversation. Then I sat quietly for a while and thought about the fact that she had been feeding this narrative to her brother for months. Months, while sleeping in the same bed as me, while saying "I love you" at the end of phone calls. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a pattern and started thinking of it as a decision I needed to make. I went back to my attorney in May. I brought the documentation, printed statements, screenshots, the account number pattern, a timeline I had written out cleanly with dates and dollar amounts. She looked through it for several minutes without saying anything. Then she looked up and said, "This is solid." $9,000 is not a life-altering sum. I want to be clear about that. This was not a devastating financial crime. But intent matters in family court. Pattern matters. And the pattern here showed a deliberate, repeated movement of money without disclosure, which, in the context of a marriage with joint finances, tells a specific story. My attorney said we had two directions we could go. I could raise it directly with my wife and see if there was an explanation, or I could continue to build the record and let it surface through the legal process if we got there. I chose to continue building, not out of revenge. I want to be honest about my own motivations here, because it would be easy to dress this up as pure strategy. There was hurt in this decision too. There was the weight of hearing my own wife describe me to her family as someone lesser than I was, while privately moving money I didn't know about, while telling her brothers stories designed to make me look incompetent. I was not the weak one, but I had been playing the long game quietly, and I needed to play it a little longer. My attorney filed a preliminary record of our consultation and the financial evidence for protective purposes. Nothing public yet, just a marker in the official record that this conversation had happened and this evidence existed. The numbers didn't lie. That was the thing about all of it. The story she was telling her family about me was a narrative, which meant it could be argued with, questioned, and eventually doubted. But the account transfers, the dates, the amounts, those were not a narrative. Those were facts. And facts, unlike impressions, don't shift depending on who's telling the story. She organized the dinner party in early July, 12 people.
Her parents, both siblings, Daniel and his wife, two family friends, and a cousin named Rita, who I had always quietly liked because she asked real questions instead of performing conversation. My wife had been in a good mood in the weeks leading up to it. Light, social, planning the menu carefully. I helped where she asked me to. I did not act differently toward her. I was present, attentive, and unremarkable. I knew the dinner was not neutral. Something about the way she mentioned the guest list a few times, casually but specifically, told me this gathering had a purpose beyond food and family. I thought it was probably another moment in the ongoing architecture of her narrative. A room full of people who had been hearing the version of me she had built, gathered together to reinforce it. Maybe to witness something. Maybe just to consolidate the social record. I decided to let her have the room. We sat down at the table around 7. The food was good. The conversation moved the way it always did in that family. Her father setting a tone, Daniel holding the floor when he wanted it, her mother managing the warmth between the more pointed exchanges. About 40 minutes in, the conversation shifted toward relationships and work and how couples navigate the pressure of building a life. Natural enough territory for that group. And then Rita, quiet until that point, asked a question that was simple and specific. She looked at me and said, "Didn't you handle the full refinance on your house last year? I remember your wife mentioning it was complicated." The table didn't go silent immediately. It took a moment for the question to land, because 3 months earlier, in a different conversation, my wife had told this same group, or most of them, that she had handled the refinance herself because I hadn't been engaged with the process.
I knew she had said this because Daniel had referenced it briefly during our phone call, in the context of making the point about financial irresponsibility. But Rita remembered a different version, because at some point in some earlier conversation, my wife had apparently told the story a different way. I looked at Rita and said simply and clearly, "Yes, I handled the full process. Took about 6 weeks. The rate we got was good, saved us close to $400 a month." I didn't look at my wife when I said it. I looked at Rita and gave her the straightforward answer. The silence came after that. Not dramatic silence, just a slight pause in the rhythm of the table, the kind that happens when something doesn't add up, and everyone at the table is privately doing the math without wanting to be the first one to say so. My wife said something quickly after, trying to smooth the moment over. A small reframe, something about how we had both been involved and how she might have simplified the story when she told it before. But you cannot unsee a gap once you've seen it. The people at that table were not unintelligent. They had been handed one version of me for a long time, and in a single honest answer, delivered without performance or drama, a crack had appeared in it. I ate my food. I made conversation. I was polite to everyone, and specifically warm to Rita, who I think understood more than she showed. My wife was quieter than usual for the rest of the evening.
I noticed. I said nothing. The week after the dinner party was the quietest we had spent together in over a year. Not hostile, just careful. She tried once to revisit the Rita moment privately. She said she just had a bad memory sometimes, that she hadn't meant to make it sound different than it was, that I shouldn't read into it. I told her I wasn't reading into anything. I told her I was fine. I was not performing calm. I actually was calm.
Because by that point, the decision was already made, had been made for a while, honestly, and what I was experiencing wasn't conflict. It was just the last few quiet miles before a stop you've already mapped. Daniel did not call again. I suspect the dinner had reached him the way it reached the others, and whatever certainty he'd had about the story he'd been told was now less certain. Her mother called me the following Wednesday. She said she just wanted to check in. She was careful and kind and did not mention anything specific. But she called me, which she had never done independently before. That told me something about what the room had been thinking after we left. 2 weeks after the dinner party, I met with my attorney and told her I was ready to move forward. She had the documentation, she had the timeline, she filed the initial paperwork the following Monday. I told my wife that evening. I sat down at the kitchen table and told her calmly and without a speech that I had filed for divorce and that she would be receiving documentation within a few days. I told her I wasn't interested in a long conflict. I told her I hoped we could move through the process with some degree of respect. She stared at me for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't think you would actually do it." I said, "I know." The legal process took 8 months. It was not clean, but it was not catastrophic. The financial documentation I had built was introduced through discovery, and the asset transfers were addressed as part of the settlement. She did not contest the core record. Her attorney negotiated a settlement that accounted for what had been moved, and we closed on the house and divided everything according to what the court outlined. I moved into a smaller place in October, my own space, quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet of a house where something was wrong. She kept the relationship with her family, as you would expect. I had no interest in taking that from her.
But I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the dinner party story had moved through that circle, not as scandal, just as a moment that had made people reconsider some things they had been told. Her brother sent me a message 6 weeks after the filing. It was short. He said he had not fully understood the situation and that he was sorry for the call he had made in April. I read it twice. I wrote back a single line. "I appreciate that. I hope you're well." That was the end of it. Rita sent a message too. She just said, "I always thought you were sharper than people gave you credit for." I didn't respond to that one. I didn't need to. Here is what she lost that I don't think she ever fully calculated. She lost the marriage, obviously, but people survive divorce. That part in isolation is not a tragedy. What she lost that cannot be filed in a court and cannot be recovered through any process is the story. She had built a careful narrative over years. She had told it to her family, to her brother, to the people around her. She had shaped their understanding of who I was and who she was in relation to me. She had positioned herself as the competent one, the strong one, the one carrying more than her share. And in one quiet dinner, in one honest answer to a simple question, that narrative developed a crack that spread outward on its own without any help from me. I never gave a speech. I never exposed her publicly. I never confronted her with a list of grievances or sent her brother a document of evidence or said a single dramatic thing to her family about who she really was. I didn't need to. The truth, given enough space and enough time, does the work without you. That is the actual lesson I took from this, and I think it's worth saying plainly. Weak is a word for people who can't wait, who react before they're ready, who need the room to see them defend themselves in real time because they're afraid that silence will be taken for guilt.
I was never afraid of that silence. I understood what it was actually doing. The people who had been handed a story about me sat at a dinner table and watched me answer one question honestly, and something shifted in them without me asking it to. Because real things shift eventually. That is their nature, that I already knew was not solid. I didn't knock it down. I just waited until it was ready to fall, and then I stepped out of the way. What you choose not to say can be its own kind of strength. What you choose not to do, when every part of you wants to react, can be the most controlled and consequential thing you ever do.
I know who I am. I knew it at that dinner table, when the word landed, and I kept my face still and looked out at the backyard, and decided that the most powerful move available to me was to let her keep believing she had won. She didn't win. She just didn't know it yet. And by the time she did, I had already done everything that needed doing.